The topics and opinions expressed on the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4WN Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4WN Radio, its employees, or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4WN Radio.
Books, beauty products, science, fashion, and glam talk. From Bollywood to Hollywood, it's Dr. Afshan Hashmi's radio show every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, right here on W4WN Radio, the Women for Women Network. And here's your host, international speaker, educator, award-winning entrepreneur, and best-selling author, Dr. Afshan N. Hashmi.
Hello everyone, this is Dr. Afshan Hashmi live in her TV show called Dr. Afshan Hashmi's TV show as well as radio show, and I am live from Florida, and this show is syndicated worldwide to 300 million listeners. And friends, today I'm doing like a series for past several weeks on Havana Syndrome, and I have a very interesting paper to discuss about it. But before, I want to remind you that these are my two books which are available wherever books are sold. The first one is The Modern Mughal Mentality, New Strategies to Succeed in India and the Global Marketplace. And the second one is The Outbreak of a Monstrous Infection. These two books were Amazon bestsellers. So please, friends, if you buy these two books, it will be a great help to me, because through the sale of these books, I finance these shows, and it is very difficult to because it requires lot of money to make these kind of shows and energy. So please, if you want these shows to go on, please keep on buying my books and give me an honest review. And now Jason, my sound engineer, will play a sponsorship movie. Hello everyone, this is Dr. Afshan Hashmi live from a barn in Virginia, and I just wanted to say, for my W4WN radio and Talk 4 TV, I request everyone who is listening to please give sponsorships if you want these shows to continue, because this show is syndicated worldwide to more than 300 million listeners. So if you give me sponsorship, your product will be promoted to more than 300 million listeners around the globe. And I wanted to tell you that to make these kind of shows, it requires a lot of money and energy. So I just want to request a sponsorship, and cheers and bye bye. So, friends, I would request you a sponsorship, and you can write to me at Afshan at drafshanhashmi.com, and I will give you a very reasonable price for playing ads in this show. Having said that, friend, let's start talking about Havana Syndrome. And this is a very interesting paper I got from New Yorker magazine, and it says the mystery of the Havana Syndrome, unexplained brain injuries affected dozens of Americans, diplomats, and spies. What happened? In the winter of 2017, the American embassy in Havana was in a precarious state. The embassy, a six-story tower that sits next to the sea wall known as Malacon, was built in 1953, and during the 5 decades in which diplomatic relations between Cuba and the United States were suspended, it had suffered from neglect. Salt and humidity from the ocean ate away at the pins holding up the marble facade. Work crews erected a fence around the most vulnerable area to ensure that no one was impaled by shards of marble crumbling from the walls. Audrey Lee, a career Forest Service officer in her late 40s, worked in a snug office on the ground floor. The name is a pseudonym which she requested in order to protect her privacy. Her life in Havana was fascinating but orderly. She lived with her husband and their 12-year-old twins in a quiet neighborhood full of diplomats, and drove an SUV to work each morning arriving habitually by 7:30. A veteran of several foreign service tours, she felt at ease in Cuba except for one peculiar incident. Earlier that year, when the family returned to Havana from a vacation, they were struck by a foul stench in their kitchen. The freezer was unplugged. Lee and her husband cleaned out the rotten food, plugged the freezer in, and went back to their routine, thinking little about the fact that someone had been there while they were away. On the evening of March 17th, Lee came home from the embassy, made dinner, and ate with the twins in the kitchen nook. Her husband was away on business. Afterwards, the kids went upstairs to play Minecraft. At around 8 o'clock, Lee washed the dishes. The kitchen lights made it hard to see out the window, but she knew that there was a wooden booth outside where Cuban police kept watch. As Lee was cleaning, she felt a sudden burst of pressure in her head, then a stabbing pain worse than she had ever experienced. Her breath quickened and she was overcome by panic. Lee had heard rumors around the embassy of colleagues falling victim to mysterious sonic attacks, but no one knew what they were or what had caused them. As the pain grew more intense, she remembered overhearing a security officer at the embassy talking about how employees could protect themselves. Get off the X, he had said, which Lee took to mean move away from the site where she experienced the pain. She made her way to the family room and took a few minutes to steady herself. After checking on the twins, she went to her bedroom to lie down, but the pain kept her from sleeping. The next morning, Lee's head still hurt. At breakfast, her son asked her to read the ingredients on a box of cereal, and she struggled moving the box back and forth as she tried to focus. In the coming weeks, she often felt dizzy and lost her balance and sometimes walked into doors. She felt as if she were moving even when she was still, a sensation that she compared to walking after taking off roller skates. She was sleeping just an hour or two a night. Co-workers noticed that she was becoming forgetful. One afternoon, a colleague stopped by her office to discuss running an errand together. When the colleague returned 5 minutes later and said, "Are you ready?" Lee looked up and said, "Ready for what?" Wary of being seen as a burden, Lee didn't mention her condition to her superiors, Jeffrey DeLontus, the embassy's chief of mission, and his deputy Scott Hamilton, but they already knew that something strange was happening. Between December 30, 2016 and February 9, 2017, at least three CIA officers working under diplomatic cover in Cuba had reported troubling sensations that seemed to leave serious injuries. When the agency sent reinforcements to Havana, at least two of them were afflicted as well. All the victims described being bombarded by waves of pressure in their heads. Unlikely, though, the CIA officers said that they heard loud sounds similar to cicadas, which seems to follow them from one room to another. But when they opened an outside door, the sounds abruptly stopped. Some of the victims said that it felt as if they were standing in an invisible beam of energy. The Americans suffered from headaches, dizziness, and a perplexing range of other symptoms. Later, specialists studied their brains and determined that the injuries resembled concussions like those suffered by soldiers struck by roadside bombs in Iraq and Afghanistan. But there were no signs of impact. One of the specialists said it was as if the victims had a concussion without concussion. Douglas Smith, who oversaw a team that examined the victims at the University of Pennsylvania, said, "None of us have ever encountered anything like this before." Experts at the CIA were baffled by what they saw as an alarming new threat, one of the most confounding medical and espionage mysteries to involve American personnel overseas since the Cold War. The affliction didn't have to name, so some of the victims started to refer to it simply as the thing. A year earlier, in March 2016, Barack Obama had flown to Havana to celebrate the restoration of diplomatic relations between the United States and Cuba after more than half a century of enmity. With Raul Castro smiling in the audience at the venerable Grand Teatro, Obama gave a speech in which he announced that he had come here to bury the last remnant of the Cold War in the Americas. The reconciliation had been at least 4 years in the making. In February 2012, Senator Patrick Leahy, Democrat of Vermont, who had favored restoring diplomatic relations with Cuba, had met with Raul Castro in Havana. Wouldn't it be nice if our grandchildren could grow up in a world where our countries no longer treat each other as enemies and our grandchildren could travel and study and learn to get along together, Leahy said. A Cuban diplomat who attended the meeting recalled that Castro replied, "Tell Obama that we shouldn't leave this situation to our children, that we have to solve this before I go." Not long after Obama was re elected in November 2012, he asked Benjamin Rhodes, one of his closest national security advisors, to lead secret negotiations with the Cubans. Rhodes knew little about Cuba and barely understood Spanish, so Ricardo Zuniga, a National Security Council officer who had previously served in Havana, was called in to work with him. Obama saw a diplomatic opening with the Cubans as something that would be nice to have rather than something that he had to have, a former administration official said. The stakes were significantly higher for Raul Castro. In the past decade, Cuba's economy had depended on subsidized oil provided by President Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, but Chavez was dying of cancer and the Cuban leadership was desperate for new sources of revenue. When Raul Castro chose his son Alejandro to serve as his intermediary with the Obama administration envoy, Zuniga felt assured that the Cubans were serious about negotiating an agreement. Now, friends, I will go on a break and will be back soon.
Would you love exposure for your business, product, or service to over 300 million potential listeners? Send an email to info@talk4media.com. And now let's hear from some of our sponsors.
Chapter 2: How Jugaad Leads to Multi-Sector Success Stories in India, including definitions of the Jugaad Management Principle business model. Of the book The Modern Mughal Mentality, New Strategies to Succeed in India and the Global Marketplace. Inspiration. True Jugaad is an inspiration on how to create products using technology that meet the price-value equation. According to a Harvard Business Review article featuring expert Prahlad and Mashelkar, most innovation programs are built on the assumptions of affluence and abundance. We see the rich and the young in both the developed and the developing countries demanding environmental friendly products and services. They also believe that affordability and sustainability are crucial to driving successful business today. New technologies and radical business models are important not only to penetrate mass markets in India but in the entire world. By reconfiguring all areas of the business structure, they will pull.
Hey, monstrous infection is spreading worldwide. OMG, is this a simple infection or a deliberate attempt to ruin the human population? Or maybe it's bioterrorism. What is this global infection and who is spreading it? Help us find out. Go to Amazon and search for The Outbreak of a Monstrous Infection. The human race needs your help to make this go viral. Go to Amazon.com and read The Outbreak of a Monstrous Infection to find out what happens next. Go now! The world is depending on you.
And now, back to Dr. Afshan Hashmi's radio show.
Before the first meetings in June 2013, Rhodes asked US intelligence analysts to give him as much information as they could about Raul and Alejandro Castro's backgrounds and intentions. Public sources noted that Alejandro had degrees in engineering and international relations and that he had published a book, Empire of Terror, about what he saw as the United States imperialist history. He was a colonel at the Interior Ministry who was sometimes known as El Tuerto or One Eye. Rumors held that he had lost vision in one eye during Cuba's military incursion into Angola. The analyst said that he was likely the country's third most powerful figure after his father and his uncle Fidel. According to reports, Raul had assigned him to oversee Cuban counterintelligence, but the analysts could tell the negotiators little about internal Cuban deliberations. A former intelligence official who worked with Rhodes and Zuniga said, "We were flying blind." The negotiators met in Ottawa and Toronto. Rhodes and his advisors found that these discussions advanced surprisingly quickly given the obstacles. In addition to the underlying tension between the two countries, the Americans assumed that Russian intelligence agencies would find out about the negotiations and try to interfere. The Russians would have every interest in with us in Cuba, Rhodes said. The US and Russia were increasingly at odds over Ukraine, and Rhodes guessed that Moscow was thinking, "You are in our neighborhood and we are going to mess around in yours." In January 2014, Rhodes and Zuniga were meeting with Alejandro Castro at a hotel near the Toronto airport when a young couple approached them in the lobby, thrust smartphones in their faces, and snapped pictures. Rhodes and Zuniga surmised that they were Russian operatives sending message from Moscow. "We know what you are up to." Rhodes waited for the Russians to leak the information in order to derail the talks, but it never happened. As the negotiators honed an agreement, Rhodes and Alejandro Castro needed to talk more often. Rhodes had access to secure communication links in the Situation Room in the basement of the White House, but the Americans couldn't share those channels with the Cubans, whom many in the U.S. security establishment viewed as formidable adversaries. Castro came up with an unorthodox solution. He created two Skype accounts, one for Rhodes and one for himself, using American sounding fake names. From then on, his spy calls were piped directly into the Situation Room. In December 2014, when Obama and Raul Castro announced that their countries were re-establishing diplomatic relations, ordinary Cubans were excited, but there were signs of disquiet inside the country's bureaucracy. The Americans concluded that most Cuban officials were only now learning that the negotiations had been held and felt they had been snubbed. US officials said these Cubans likely suspected that Obama, despite his talk of a fresh start, had the same objectives as his predecessor's regime change in Havana. In the United States, anti Castro politicians were also upset about the secret negotiations. Just before the announcement of the reapproachment, White House officials notified Senator Marco Rubio, Republican of Florida and a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, at a classified briefing about the agreement. Rubio, a vociferous critic of the Cuban government, argued that it would embolden the country's dictatorial rulers, who he believed wanted to ease Cuba's financial difficulties without loosening their grip on power. But Rubio did see one benefit in reopening the embassy in Havana. It would create opportunities for the CIA to expand its intelligence collection efforts on the island where Russia and China were increasingly influential. In Some recent interview, Rubio declined to comment on the closed door sessions, but he said, I had no practical ability to change the Obama policy once it was made. Therefore, I am often in the business of making lemonade out of lemons. The US compound in Havana resembles a miniature version of the United Nations headquarters. It was designed by Harrison and Abramovich, the New York firm that also helped design the UN. In the main building known as the Chancery, the chief of mission has an office on the fifth floor with a balcony overlooking the ocean. When De Laurentiis started in the job, he enjoyed bringing guests onto the balcony to admire the view until engineers advised him that the crumbling facade made it too dangerous. One floor above De Laurentiis' office was the CIA station, which occupied the most restricted area in the building. Compared with CIA stations in Moscow City and Bogota, the one in Havana was tiny, often composed of just three intelligence officers. The biggest threat facing the embassy was espionage. The perimeter of the facility was secured by a force of Cuban guards who were vetted by the government. Similarly, most of the local employees who worked inside the embassy were handpicked Cuban nationals. The Americans assumed that many were informants, so to prevent bugs from being slipped into sensitive offices, even cleaning and maintenance crews were forbidden to go above the second floor unless they were escorted by one of the Marine guards who controlled access to the chancery. The compound on the Malecon was closed in 1961 after Fidel Castro seized power and the United States severed diplomatic relations. In 1977, when Jimmy Carter was president, the US and Cuba signed an agreement establishing the US interest section in Havana, which operated under the formal protection of the Embassy of Switzerland. After Obama and Raul Castro reached their agreement to reopen their embassies, the Americans asked the Cubans to ease restrictions on the number of U.S. diplomatic personnel allowed to work in Cuba. The Cubans pushed back. A larger staff at the embassy would create new opportunities to bring in spies and human rights officers who would work with descendants. Benjamin Rhodes tried to reassure the Cubans, allowing more diplomats into Cuba and letting them get out of Havana will allow them to meet with a wider variety of Cubans and not just dissidents, he said. Eventually, the Cubans agreed to let the number of U.S. diplomatic personnel increase from 51 to more than 70. However, Republicans in Congress who opposed re-establishing diplomatic relations blocked funding for the additional positions. As a result, only 54 of the agreed upon slots could be filled. The Cubans were even more suspicious when the State Department said that it would need to send large shipments of supplies to the embassy. The Chancery was last renovated in the mid 90s and was in desperate need of a total rehab. Patrick Kennedy, who was then the Undersecretary of State for Management, said finding supplies in Havana was impractical. There was little to buy, and more important, the Americans suspected that Cuban intelligence would slip listening devices into almost everything they purchased on the island. To avoid penetration, even the furniture had to be shipped in. State Department officials told the Cubans that they needed to send several large steel containers by sea and that they wanted them to be exempt from inspection. The request became a crucial sticking point in the negotiations. Much of the wrangling fell to Robert Jacobson, the Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs. In non permissive environments, you have to be able to send a container that they won't be able to look inside, she explained. When we built our new embassy in China, they gave us an unlimited quota for secure containers. The Cubans argued that history had left them apprehensive. She recalled, they said to us, you used your secure containers in the past to bring in materials for counter revolutionary groups, which is true, but we hadn't really been doing that for some time. The thing is, you had give a fax machine to a descendant and it would be seized the next day, so it was kind of pointless anyway. After 6 months of negotiations, the Cubans grudgingly agreed to allow one container into the country without an inspection. American officials are vague about its content, but they say it was full of electronics, including secure communication gear. On July 20, 2015, the United States and Cuba formally reestablished diplomatic relations. A few weeks later, Secretary of State John Kerry presided over a flag raising ceremony in Havana, attended by three retired American Marines who had lowered the flag when the embassies closed half a century before. Outside the compound, Cuban security men kept an eye on several hundred locals who had gathered to cheer and to wave little Cuban and American flags. If you don't understand anything, this article appeared in New York Magazine and you can get it from there. A few weeks later, an unmarked US government plane landed at an airstrip in Havana carrying the last person in the world the Castros might be expected to welcome, John Brennan, the director of the CIA. Brennan was there to meet with Alejandro Castro and discuss increasing intelligence cooperation between the two countries. Brennan considered Cuba's spy agencies the most capable in Latin America and hoped to work with them against drug cartels and terrorist networks. Brennan's enthusiasm wasn't universally shared in the U.S. intelligence community. Some officials feared that Cuba could exploit any openings to expand its operations against the United States. Others, though, saw the idea of greater cooperation as an embodiment of the old adage, if you can't beat them, join them. The CIA, which prides itself on being the world's best intelligence service, doesn't advertise the fact that it has repeatedly been outplayed by the spy networks of an impoverished Caribbean state. But over the years, Cuba's intelligence officers have been remarkably successful at recruiting Americans. They have penetrated just about anybody that the agency have ever tried to run against them. James Casson, who was the head of U.S. interest sections in the 2000, said they basically beat us. After the Cold War ended and Russia more or less abandoned Havana as a military outpost, the CIA concentrated less on Cuba, but Cuban intelligence agencies never took their eyes off the US. Everything that they did focused on us, Casson said. At one point, Cuban security services assigned a battalion of intelligence officers, estimates range from hundreds to thousands, to monitor the U.S. interest section. John Caulfield, a former head of the interest section, used to tell his counterpart, "Frankly, I think you have vastly overestimated my capability of destabilizing your society." Brennan's talks with Alejandro Castro took place at a discreet government guest house where a day of formal negotiations was followed by a banquet featuring a spit roasted pig. The Cuban government has long cast the CIA as the ultimate enemy, dedicating large portions of a museum, the denouncement memorial, to railing against the agency's purported offenses. 637 conspiracies to assassinate the commander in chief. Nevertheless, US officials said that during the talks, Cuban leaders made it clear that they respected the CIA and, in fact, found it more reliable than the State Department, which during George W. Bush administration had aided programs intended to undermine the Cuban government. Rhodes sometimes joked with Alejandro Castro, who thought that the CIA would be the agency which the Cubans would trust. Brennan and Alejandro Castro agreed on a series of steps to build confidence. One called for the Cubans to post an officer in Washington to act as a former liaison between the two countries' intelligence agencies. In the end, the Cubans didn't send a liaison officer. American officials speculated that Alejandro Castro had been undermined by hardliners in his system who opposed improving relations. Alejandro, in turn, complained that the CIA didn't follow through with its commitments and said that he believed Brennan was impeded by Cuba hawks at the agency. The American and Cuban publics overwhelmingly support more engagement, Roth said in an interview, but there are antibodies embedded in both governments that don't want to let go of the conflict. As Obama prepared for his visit in March 2016, U.S. diplomats started to brief the Cubans on the army of security men, transport aircraft, and armored limousine that would descend on the island. To Cuban hardliners, it probably looked like the long feared invasion, John Colfett said. The Americans were thrilled with the pageantry. On March 22nd, Obama gave a speech about democracy and human rights, which was televised, uncensored in Cuba. I have come here to extend the hand of friendship to the Cuban people, he said. During a baseball game attended by the two countries' presidents and thousands of Cubans, Rhodes introduced Alejandro Castro and his young daughter to Obama, a public gesture of goodwill. The detente brought some rapid changes to the island, including a surge in American tourists from 90,000 in 2014 to 600,000 last year. Companies from Europe and the US rushed to invest in Miami style bars and restaurants opened in Havana. Rihanna went for a photo shoot. The makers of the Fast and Furious movies filmed a rambunctious race scene on the Malecon. Audrey Lee arrived in June 2015, 6 weeks before the embassy formally reopened. She was excited about her assignment. She had previously worked in Africa and Asia, and when the State Department had asked her where she wanted to go next, she requested Havana. Lee and her husband were fascinated by the country's history and its music. Their twins had grown up hearing their great grandfather's stories about his time on the island as a Navy seaman. We just thought it would be the perfect place for us, she explained. Lee and her family settled into an airy Spanish style house with a formal dining room and a backyard full with tropical flowers and mango trees. Along the fence, her husband planted tomatoes and chili peppers. At the embassy, an optimistic mood prevailed. Lee loved working alongside the Cuban staffers in the counselor section. Some of them came with her to one of Obama's appearances in Havana and wept when he shook their hands. And now, friends, I will go on a break and will be back soon.
Would you love exposure for your business, product, or service to over 300 million potential listeners? Send an email to info@talkformedia.com. And now let's hear from some of our sponsors.
A monstrous infection is spreading worldwide. Oh my God, is this a simple infection or a deliberate attempt to ruin the human population? Or maybe it's bioterrorism. What is this global infection and who is spreading it? Help us find out. Go to Amazon and search for the outbreak of a monstrous infection. The human race needs your help to make this go viral. Go to Amazon.com and read The Outbreak of a Monstrous Infection to find out what happens next. Go now. The world is depending on you.
The Outbreak of a Monstrous Infection, Chapter 1, 1964 to 2018, and this is the sample track. and it is read by Dr. Afshan Hashmi. In a sprawling bungalow in Potomac, Maryland, USA, lived Dr. Honey Singh, a board-certified internal medicine and family practice physician, along with his beautiful wife, Baby Singh. Baby Singh was a fashionista and was funding women's causes through her Honey Bay Foundation. She had a ladies' book club by the name of Baby's Glam and Glitzy Club, which had many glam and glitzy ladies who were professionals living in Washington, D.C., Potomac, Maryland, Virginia, and even Beverly Hills, California, as well as elites from all of America meeting at her place on the last Wednesday of every month discussing various aspects of charities they wanted her and Dr. Honey to fund. In this club, there was a wide spectrum of career women. There were doctors, lawyers, actresses, business owners, and models, to name a few. In these book club meetings, members would come prepared after reading a book of a famous woman author, and that author was even invited from any part of the world to give her presentation, followed by a Q&A in this prestigious and elite gathering.
And now, back to Dr. Afshan Hashmi's radio show.
After Obama's visit, however, U.S. officials took note of a distant backlash. Fidel Castro published a wary letter in the Communist Party daily Granma that reprised his long years of conflict with American presidents. Nobody should be under the illusion that the people of this noble and selfless country will renounce the glory, the rights, or the spiritual wealth they have gained, he wrote. Despite years of financial privation, Fidel also, who was approaching 90, insisted that the isolation was preferable to engagement with a long-time enemy. We do not intend to the empire to give us anything, he wrote 3 weeks later at a Communist Party Congress. Bruno Rodriguez Pereira, the foreign minister, described Obama's visit as an attack on our history, culture, and symbols. At a military parade in Havana, soldiers chanted an ominous message: "We are going to make war if imperialism comes." Shouting Obama's name, they threatened to give you a cleansing with rebels and mortar and make you a hat out of bullets to the head. If Cuba's communist traditionalists feared that Obama's overtures had been a pretext for increasing the United States' influence, Raul Castro seems unconcerned. When the foreign ministry asked foreign ambassadors in Havana to attend a briefing, the Americans weren't sure what to expect. Despite Fidel's rhetoric, Cuban officials at the briefing declared Obama's visit a success. One attendee said that the Cubans seems to want to send dual message, one to domestic hardliners who were hostile to the US and another to international audiences who supported normalization. So if you want, this is the New Yorker magazine and it is a very long report. So you can get it from New Yorker magazine. And now friends, I will ask my sound engineer to play the last commercial, and that is about sponsorship. Hello everyone, this is Dr. Afshan Hashmi, and I just wanted to request you that please give me sponsorship, and I am live from Maryland, and this show is syndicated worldwide with more than 300 million listeners, and to produce these kind of shows it requires a lot of time and money. So please give me sponsorship if you want these shows to continue. And friends, these are my two books. The first one is a business book, The Modern Mughal Mentality, New Strategies to Succeed in India and the Global Marketplace. And second one is a science fiction cozy mystery, The Outbreak of a Monstrous Infection. And for this book, I am looking any Amazon producers, Netflix producers, or Bollywood or Hollywood producers to come, and I want a movie to be made out of this book. And these two books were Amazon bestsellers. So if you want to write to me at Afshan at drafshanhashmi.com and give me an honest review after reading these books. These books are available wherever books are sold, and you can write to me at Afshan at drafshanhashmi.com if you are interested to make a movie out of this book. And these two books were Amazon bestsellers. Having said that, friends, please give me sponsorship for my shows because it requires lot of money and energy to produce these kind of shows, and I will give you a very reasonable price, and you can write to me at Afshan at drafshanhashmi.com. And now, friends, I will see you tomorrow with the last episode, which is episode 6 of the Havana Syndrome. And how did you like today's show? Just let me know through my social media. And having said that, my website is www.afshanhashmi.com. And cheers and bye bye. And now
You have been listening to Dr. Afshan Hashmi's radio show on W4WN Radio, the Women for Women Network. Tune in live right here every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Would you love exposure for your business, product, or service to over 300 million potential listeners? Send an email at info@talk4media.com. And remember, if you missed any part of this show or want to hear it again, find our featured show on iHeartRadio, where all past episodes are available on demand 24/7. See you next Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time.